Thank you, Katrin. Thank you, Teresa. Thank you, Thomas. Yeah. We are moving on to the last part of our morning session. It is our first keynote lecture, actually, and our first keynote speaker here at the Human Brain Project Summit. And it is an honor, actually, to introduce Professor Michael Breakspear. I mentioned him earlier. He traveled all over from Australia. He is a very special man that I have known now for about 2 decades. He's unique in many different ways. One way is he is a psychiatrist and a computational neuroscientist. He has made major contributions to the mathematical modeling of brain dynamics, in particular with applications to mental disorders in the fields of bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, but also with applications to dementia and healthy aging. At the University of Newcastle, Australia, he's at the Hunter Medical Research Institute, where he leads the System Neuroscience Group, a group very heterogeneous, again, composed of psychologists, physicists, neuroimaging scientists, and psychiatrists. As a scientist, he has pushed forward computational modeling, but he is also a psychiatrist that is still seeing patients. So he has his feet really in the two worlds, theory and applications with real-world contact with patients simultaneously. Originally, he has been educated at the University of Sydney, in particular studied medicine, but with accompanying degrees in arts, that would be philosophy and mathematics, and in sciences, neuroscience and physics. So you see, there the disciplines are coming together. He's fellow of the Australian and New Zealand colleges of psychiatry. And if I understand correctly, Michael, you're also serving weekly at the Aboriginal Medical Clinic. So reaching out to provide his services there. So it is a pleasure to have you here. It is a pleasure that you traveled so far in order to share your time with us and give us our first keynote lecture on the future of neurosciences. Michael Breakspear. It's a pleasure that you're here. All yours. To advance, left button, and then you can wiggle it.
Okay, thanks very much, Victor. And I'd like to thank both Professor Yrsa and Professor Katrina Munz for the pleasure and the honour to come and share with you some perspectives of ours from Australia. And I'd like to begin by really congratulating the community here for the wonderful and very inspiring achievements of the Human Brain Project. Listening to Professor Munz's talk in particular, I was really reminded of a lot of the synergies that we've been doing. And during the pandemic, we were rather closeted away down there in Australia. And so it's wonderful to come back and see all my friends and colleagues here. And perhaps through a sort of Antipodean prism, reflect some of my own perspectives on the future of digital neuroscience. So I'll speak in 4 different areas, and Victor can start nodding his head if I go over time. Digital atlas and maps, brain simulation platforms, brains and machines, and maybe the point I'd like to make will be a notion of human-centred digital futures. It's actually a friend and colleague of mine, Roland Girk, from Australia. Okay, so onto digital atlas and maps. I mean, digital computer was more or less invented shortly after the theoretical contributions of Turing 80 years ago. And in that 80 years, the world has really been remastered, reimagined, uploaded and rebooted in ways that could scarcely be imagined a century ago. And in the same way, digital atlas and maps continue the prescient work of Brodmann and other early neurocartographers, really in the final frontier, which is that of the brain and the neurosciences. And likewise, and once again, we've seen some of these sort of images, the digital realizations of neurons and neural circuits that realize the beautiful drawings of Kajal. And these are enabled by advances in high-quality imaging and segmentation techniques through a number of large organisations based on machine learning. This is just one, but there are several of these incarnations. Now, human systems, if I was making an analogy with the world, don't consist merely of these multi-level systems, but of a vast network of connections between them. One path of which I took yesterday from Newcastle to Marseille. And likewise, we've come to better realise and understand that functional neural activity unfolds on dense structural brain networks. And this is an example of a whole brain connectome reconstructed from non-invasive diffusion imaging, but it's extremely important that we validate and compare these with more direct optical imaging. Now, like Earth systems, and I've got to come back at the end of this notion of Earth systems, brain systems comprise multi-scale and multiplexed networks. What I mean by a multiplex network is that to get here from Newcastle, I walked to the station, I took the train to Sydney, I took a flight, I took another flight, then I took a taxi, and then I walked to my hotel room. Each one of these is a path from A to B, supported by a series of networks or a component from networks of different scale and speed. And likewise in the brain, we have these multiplexed networks comprised of different scales, all nested carefully within each other. Each scale that we see in the brain is acquired through specific imaging technologies. The key thing, the key challenge, is to understand how to overlay these faithfully and patch them together. And here's a very successful example of that. This is from Google Earth. We've all played around with this. I was interested to learn that it was in the original software platform was developed here in Europe by two Danish software engineers doing software for gaming. And then about a quarter of queries to Google about spatial location, and so that inspired them to take it up. Now, the Big Brain Project, as I understand it, I'm not an expert here, is really one of the first big ambitious attempts to do something like this to the brain, to so really image the brain at very fine scale, but at the same time reconstruct the origins of that in three-dimensional space. To show how open science works, my team was able to put this together using data available from the Human Brain Project and other open science platforms. Now, like Earth systems, the brain is multi-layered. If you go to Google, you can see train systems, road systems, you can see a physical overlay. And the brain is very much like this. It's not just multi-scale, but at any particular scale, there's different layers. So there's structural layers, metabolic layers, functional, evolutionary, electrophysiological, neuroreceptor and genomic layers. All of these live within a common anatomical space, but each represents a different layer of cortical function. And this comes from Neuromaps, the beautiful open science of Bratislav Misic and colleagues in Montreal. So this is a very fine-scaled view of the brain, but digital neuroscience has also enabled and put into the open domain very large population digital biobanks. So I'm just going to show you a study that I did with some colleagues that you'll find on bioRxiv, but should be in press soon. This is actually a study of over 40,000 well-phenotyped individuals from the UK Biobank. And we heard before that the brain is part of the body, so we were able to use this data and construct biomarkers of the major physiological, metabolic and cardiovascular systems in which the brain is embedded. What we did in this study, I should acknowledge Etienne, the first author, and Andrew Zaleski here, is take individuals' chronological age and then with machine learning regression predict that in a cross-validation sense. So we have, if you like, on the x-axis chronological age, and then from other unseen individuals we have their predicted chronological age. This is probably something many of you have heard of. If you're above this diagonal, then that particular organ or brain of yours is older than your chronological age. You have a positive brain age gap. And if it's below you, your organ or your brain is a little bit younger than your chronological age. So this is an age gap for all major systems in the body. This is one of the major findings from this paper. These on the left are the life exposures that make those organs of ours a little bit older. So these are positive age gaps presented visually. But the good news is there's also some negative age gaps. So these are life exposures that make these various organs look younger. And being in France, I'm pleased to say that we see cheese intake on the right-hand side of this diagram, although it's quite a small line, but it's still reassuring at breakfast this morning. We can also look at, this is a longitudinal data set, so if you're young, if your organs are younger or older than chronological age at baseline, how does that influence the aging of other organ systems in the body at 2 and then 5 years subsequently? So if we, for example, you see here cardiac age, if your cardiac age is older than your chronological age, then that will accelerate, I use the term loosely, but increase the aging, for example, of your renal and musculoskeletal systems. So these are positive feedback loops. Of course, if you're younger, then they confer a slower age rate of these other organs. And we can also, in the same framework, this is done with causal Bayesian networks, look at the effect of accelerated or slower aging of these body systems on the age velocity of the different compartments of the brain, functional connectivity, white matter, brain, and grey matter, and also cognition. That's just an example in the health space of what we can do with big digital biobanks. I'm going to move on to brain simulation platforms. This is a bit of an overview, so not too much depth here. Now, most of us would be familiar with the Hodgkin-Huxley model. It's a computational biophysical model of how a neuron spikes, derived from close observation of individual axons, actually from the squid, and the flow of ions in and out of voltage gated ion channels. So this was a major achievement of the single neuron, and I'll just walk through some efforts to upscale from single neurons up to the whole brain, basically in the same conceptual framework. A lot of this has been leveraged and enabled by digital platforms. But to step back and have a look at what a modelling framework or enterprise like this might look like, what might be the conceptual elements. Imagine I woke up this morning, I look out of my beautiful hotel room at beautiful Marseille. It was a bit windy yesterday. I'm wondering, it's a bit cloudy today. Is it going to be a nice day for the beach? There are beaches here in Marseille. Or should I take an umbrella and go out? And so I can answer this question by going on the Weather Channel or Google Weather or whatever. So how does this work? It's actually a very sophisticated weather and climate models operating, and this is a visualization called windy.com. It's helpful, as it turns out, for surfing. And there are a number of layers. So this is another multi-layer system. Here we've got waves, we've got wind, we've got sea temperature, we've got land temperature, and these are schematized here. These are actually being enacted on large supercomputers in tiny little elements around the globe, getting more and more sophisticated every year. And in essence, in each one of these tiny capsules or grids is being solved numerically something approximating the Navier-Stokes equation. That's just the motion of fluid according to classic mechanics. So this is fluid that obeys Newton's equations of motion. The details aren't important. Now, in many, many tens of thousands of regions around the world, weather measurements are being acquired that are then furnishing these models with observations and parameters. This is done in an iterative way where the models are forecasting and then measurements are being taken. They're being used to update those models in a number of different frameworks. Broadly speaking, this is called data assimilation. And this is absolutely crucial for the accuracy and reliability of this enterprise of large-scale modelling. So if at the heart of weather forecasting is an equation, we might say as well, at the heart of a generative model of brain activity, there should be a generative model, and I'll come to that in a few moments. It's important to understand that the generative models those parameters can't be directly observed, so we need an observation model. And in neuroscience, for example, at large scale, we've got non-invasive EEG, MEG, and fMRI data. And of course, we've got behaviour, something that we often overlook. So we can do the same thing, basically, in data assimilation in the field of computational neuroscience. And it's important that the complexity of the model sort of meets the complexity and richness of the data. Otherwise, we'll be falling into a prospect of overfitting, and that will lead to very poor prediction accuracy. I'm pleased to say, of course, that this lies at the heart of the virtual brain. This is a paper from the virtual brain that we've already seen elements of this morning, where there's this beautiful loop between measurements, generative modelling, predictions, observations, and model updating in a particular statistical framework. Now, I said before that the origin of spikes in single neurons was more or less solved in the 1950s and developed, of course, over the decades. And Alain Destek is here. He was one of the pioneers in bringing these models further and further into the physiological space. But single neurons are embedded in these rich functional subsystems, cortical sheets, and this very complex system of order 10 to the something to the something that we saw at the beginning of today. Individual spikes are, in most cases, far too weak to influence perception and action. And I think there's a consensus that it's the population activity that really is important for perception and behaviour. I don't think everybody is quite on board, but certainly there's some convergence in the field. So what would a model that achieves this look like? We could consider, for example, this is a model of 1,000 neurons using some simplification of the Hodgkin-Huxley models. At 2 time points, this is actually being brute force simulated forward. We get population activity. These are these empirical histograms, empirical being, in this case, in silico. We can then do something called a mean field approximation, where we say, this looks like a fairly simple probability distribution function, so we've got to throw away everything but a few of the moments of this distribution, maybe the value and the precision, or the mean and the variance. And these work if we propagate these reduced mean field models forward, and they actually recapitulate what the spiking network models were doing. And this was evaluated in a perspective paper back in 2008 by Gusteco and others. And this is a common approach used in physics. It's not something that we've just invented in the neurosciences. So we've got these very complex models at the scale of individual neurons with all their channels and dendrites, multi-compartment models that are in fact mean field models. Even the Hodgkin-Huxley model is a mean field model, but it's the mean field of a single neuron. Then we can replace this with increasingly abstract models until we get up to a neural mass or neural field model. And as we've seen, the Human Brain Project and other projects around the world have a number of these simulation platforms at different scales. I'm going to just quickly show an example of a neural mass model, something that I played around with a long time ago with John Terry, who's here, and Carl Friston. It's really a toy model, but I just use it because it does demonstrate some simple behaviours. It's pyramidal cells and inhibitory cells interacting, and the pyramidal cells have potassium channel conductance. So they're sort of a Morris-Lacar-like model. And then it's scaled up fairly crudely to the population. Here we see this model, in any case, showing burst spike behaviour at 3 Hertz on something called a quasi-periodic attractor. And if we just change some of the model parameters a little bit, we go through what's called a bifurcation, and the system now evolves on a chaotic attractor. So we took this chaotic attractor, we used it to represent a tiny patch of cortex. We did this in 2 regions initially. Each of these equations of motion is a chaotic attractor. Now with advances in diffusion imaging, we can let all of these systems, hundreds of them, interact each other with the connection informed by empirical connectivity. And this was a series of work that started about 10 years ago and continues with increasing sophistication today. But let's just see what happens in this very simple model. In broad regions of parameter space, you get these beautiful emerging large-scale wave patterns, rotating waves, breathers, travelling waves. These are, as an applied mathematician, just fun to look at. They're well recognised in other excitable media. What's interesting in this particular model is that the simulated in silico brain cycles from one of these states or metastates to the next in a form of metastability. Now, waves have been observed in a spectrum of neuroimaging data across species, functions, areas, data modalities. Every year there's new papers appearing. And at the core of these waves, when we strip away the details of connectivity, the connection strength in the cortex drops off more or less exponentially. So you've got this sort of what we call a synaptic kernel. And this supports the propagation of waves of activity across the brain in this way. Very crudely, the sort of wavelength and frequency of these waves is consistent with certain electrophysiological recordings. This is a recording of sleep spindles from Terry Sinowski's lab, and our model recapitulates several empirical features of this model. We can strip down to understand what's happening beneath these models. Each of these nodes has a state. We can look at the difference in states and the local neighbours. That'll give us these vectors. And then we can piece these vectors together in streamlines. So this is the underlying dynamic architecture of these waves. If we put it all together and we simulate it forward, we get something like this. So each wave pattern has a particular dynamic streamline architecture with sinks and sources and other exotic dynamical beings. When they collide, the wave loses stability and jumps on to the next pattern. And this is not unlike our meteorological friends and colleagues are doing. You know, they've got observables, but beneath them, they've got generative models and they've got hidden states. Now, Earth system modelling is very well funded because if you want to fly from Sydney to London, you better know what the weather's going to be if you put 800 people in an Airbus. If you want to fly out and put a satellite into space, you better know what the weather's doing. That's why there's big funding in these platforms from NASA. But with the Human Brain Project and other large-scale ambitious projects, this is what we're seeing and now in the neuroscience space, as we've heard. Now, the other really cool type of modelling is to strip away even more detail and just model the cortex as a continuous sheet. These are so-called neural field theories. This is an equation here. The details aren't important. It's simply a damped propagating wave equation. And I'll come back to these in a moment. Now, why would we do something like this? In fact, I didn't develop it. I'll come back to the formative papers later on. Because this is the way many complex systems self-organise, or many natural systems. These are called Chladni plates, after a German physicist, Professor Chladni. Many of you may have seen this. You take a square or round plate, you put sand on it, and you vibrate it at these different frequencies. So what's happening here? There's a generative model. It's a complicated one, even by my standards, because it's fourth order. But what's happening when you put energy into the system, you are exciting a number of underlying Fourier modes. And so the wave equation will tell you, according to the frequency, what modes are being excited. And the energy moves away from the peaks and the troughs towards the isolines in these modes. This is, by the way, at the heart of quantum mechanics. Schrödinger's wave equations in a spherical space now can be decomposed into these spherical harmonics. And what we see in atoms, this is the hydrogen atom, not cartoonised up the top there, of course, is the excitation of a number of these modes, depending on the energy that is submitted to them. So it might seem crazy to do this to the brain, but we can do this to the brain. We can take the folded geometric surface of the cortex and we can do a modal decomposition, in this case using something called the Laplace-Beltrami operator. And these are then the solutions to a wave equation posed on the surface of the cortex. So here's the propagation of an atom according to Schrödinger's equation. I got this on Wikipedia. And this is the propagation of a wave obeying the wave equation and constrained by cortical geometry. So these two things are more or less led by the same generative process. We used this a couple of years ago to understand sleep transitions in neonatal EEG. This is quite a complex process, but basically we took EEG, we looked at the source space, we expressed the composite of cortical activity as the excitation of a few number of modes. We did model inversion, and we found just 3 modes very accurately captured EEG from these neonates. And moreover, it was just a change of energy in 2 modes that captured the transition from active to quiet sleep, which is a neonatal equivalent of deep to REM sleep. Very recently, starting with Kevin Aquino, James Pang down in Alex Finito's lab, also with myself and Peter Robinson, took 10,000 brain maps from the Human Connectome project and just asked how many of these modes are required to capture task-elicited behaviour. And it turns out, as you see on the left here, not that many. 100 modes, and you've got 0.8 accuracy. And this is all done with cross-validation. And if you consider that traditionally we've been looking at task activity through the changes of activity in tens of thousands of individual voxels, we've got an extraordinary collapse of complexity here. And by 100 modes or 200, we've got 90% of the variance. And this is quite a change in the way of looking at the brain, that most task activities aren't confined to local effects, local areas, but excite brain-wide modes with wavelengths of greater than 6 centimetres. And so this really is a conceptual challenge to understand how do we reconcile this with the very detailed biologicals curated data that we've been also carefully acquiring. And this is online for archive for a while, but I'm excited to say it'll soon be published. Okay, so I guess I've got a few minutes. I'm going to talk about brains and machines now. And there are a whole grab bag of terms that we hear these days, and it'd be impossible to cover them all. But I just want to reflect a little bit on large language models and also large graphics models. So I was pleased to hear about the European version, which is cost efficient, but at great cost to carbon budget, these AI platforms. So they're deep neural networks. I won't go through the details. They basically learn a mapping from inputs to outputs. And the weights of these units are updated so that the in cross-validation or held-out data, some sort of prediction is fulfilled. But what's happened, as we've seen in the last, well, I mean, a lot of us have only been aware of it for some months to years, but with this huge corpus of the human endeavour now available on the interweb, with many of us voluntarily or unwittingly submitting our own personal digital data, these large deep neural networks and other machine learning platforms can be trained and cross-validated on massive corpus of text, image, games, you mention it. Then these are available in a user interface. You put in a prompt as a human and you get an answer. There are other variations, of course. Now, you'll be disappointed that I'm not sort of a masterful digital artist. All these beautiful images, almost embarrassed to say, were gleaned from Midjourney, which is one of these large models trained on the blood, sweat and tears of many artists, and I'll come back to that. We can go to ChatGPT, explain digital neuroscience in Shakespearean prose. In sooth, digital neuroscience doth blend the brain with computer, and such technologies trend. To fathom the depths of this organ so grand, methods like brain imaging and modelling by hand. Okay, it's pretty cheesy, and the bard wouldn't like it, but it's not bad. I mean, it's better than I would do. And in fact, we see ChatGPT-4 now passing tertiary level entrance exams with very high human level skill. You can ask these platforms to do your programming. Somebody asked to write a Python program that was a mashup of Pong and the game of life, and it worked once it was initiated. And you can ask it to solve mathematical problems. Now, bear in mind, many of these are incredibly inaccurate, but every now and then they're quite insightful, increasingly so. And this has, led to some conjecture that these large language models are sparks of general human-like intelligence. If you train them on detailed neuroscience data, you actually see there's a mirroring of the hierarchical computational principles of cortex and other animal brains and the learned architecture of these neural networks. And these embody the brain-like principles of perception, prediction, and inference. This is a pretty image that I saw on Twitter, and it's by this group here. Now, just to finish my talk on human-centered digital futures, humans and other animals, we're all looking at different animals, rodents, flies, worms, are active agents dynamically embedded in interpersonal, social, cultural, and historical systems that we build. Deep neural networks at their core static matrices performing stochastic interpolation. And you can see it in the architecture. There's a set of inputs on the left. There's weights that predict outputs, but they're nothing other than a weighted contribution from their inputs. So they're a form of interpolation. And I'll show you a little bit more what I mean by this. We had a big debate in my lab about this. So I asked it to solve Fermat's last theorem, which has been solved. And ChatGPT said, as it had knowledge of Fermat's last theorem, it could describe the techniques that we used to solve it. It has some caveats there. Then I asked it to solve the Riemann hypothesis that hasn't been solved, and ChatGPT told me no, it couldn't solve it because there was no human solution. I think this is an interesting perspective. It's my perspective on the limitations of these large machine learning algorithms. But there's an even better perspective. Now, I love these algorithms and I've used them, but not everybody's a fan of them. How many people have heard of Nick Cave? Yes, he's a wonderful Australian rock musician. I saw him live just 6 months ago in Newcastle, and Nick's lost a son, and he's become quite public with this online thing called the Red Hand Files, and he asks people to ask him questions. So he's a bit like a human ChatGPT. And someone asked it to write a song in the style of Nick Cave and then submitted the results to Nick Cave. And I encourage you to read this because it's just a superb artist's reflection on machine learning. Its replication is travesty. On the surface, it may be indistinguishable from an original, but it would always be a replication, a kind of burlesque. I mean, Nick's really grabbing on the notion here that to be human and to be an artist is to go into human experience and then outside of that experience. And this is something that a machine learning algorithm can never do with its trap of interpolation. Mark, thanks for the song, but with all the love and respect in the world, this song, he actually wrote, "This song sucks." A grotesque mockery of what it is to be human. So that's a pretty harsh takedown. But it's worth, I think, as we move into this exciting digital world, to bear in mind the potential and also the human perspective. I would also say all the work that I presented on neural field theory, for example, was predated by hundreds of years by the work of people like Fourier, Laplace, Poincaré. I'm visiting France. They're all my favourite French mathematicians, carrying a little bit of local favour here. Kajal's extraordinary drawings of the human brain. And I'll just also be a little bit more close to the personal here. This wave equation that we developed, if you go back almost 30 years, you'll see one of the greats of European neuroscience, Herman Harkin, with his young protege, Vic Yersa, in a wonderful paper with really first principles derivations. And Peter Robinson, my postdoc supervisor, was doing this more or less in parallel, putting in the thalamus. And I think it's important to remember conceptual and analytic work always predates digital neuro discoveries. So in summary, more progress is required to realise the full power of digital maps and simulation platforms. We can see what they're capable of. We can look at other applications, and we can glimpse them now in neuroscience. And with the Human Brain Project, we're very close to sort of, mass scale realising their potential. Despite their human-level performance on prompt responses, AI systems remain static. I think I'll let Nick do a dirty number on them. And digital futures require to remain human, asterisks, other animals, centred in both objective and process. What I mean by that is, we need, as scientists, and one of the masterful achievements of the Human Brain Project is the collaboration. And we need to fund young people and bright people of the future. So I'd like to acknowledge where I work at the University of Newcastle, HMRI, and our funding sources. It's my Twitter page. Vic started the meeting by talking about diversity. We're actually in Australia learning that Australia was like Europe 200 years ago with 200 nations. And because if we don't acknowledge it, we don't erase it. It's still there. So we actually live on a Wabigal people, and we're learning about the beautiful country. And in my group, we've got two extraordinary Indigenous research fellows, Jen and Guy. And this is the Awabakal totem, which is at the University of Newcastle. And what we're learning and what I'm learning is if we could just sit back and listen, and we can learn in particular about a culture that for 50, 60,000 or more years has understood and embodied the coupling of human systems and earth systems in a way that we're beginning to grapple, hopefully in time, here in our Eurocentric culture. So thank you very much.